I'm Justin Schell, Digital Humanities Specialist, working with Dash a lot. Dash is an interdisciplinary program from the libraries that's looking at collaborative practices and emerging digital tools and methodologies, text mining, data mining, mapping, the use of crowdsourcing, things like that, and looking at it from this kind of interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary perspective. So rather than focusing on just how, English uses Python and journalism uses Python and geography uses Python, but trying to build a community between these different groups and learning from each other and having the libraries be a kind of hub for a lot of this work that's going on campus right now, and being a space for referral, recommendation, showcase, things like that. So we do workshops, we do trainings, do individual consultations, and we do these monthly events. Today's event is on this really broad amorphous term called critical code studies, which the very basic definition that I believe Mark Marino came up with, and he's the person who defined the code. He's at USC. He's a literature scholar, broadly conceived, as the extra functional significance of code. What code means beyond its basic immediate executable function. And this is a whole wide field discussion ranging from what does it mean for there to be a feminist human-computer interaction? What does it mean for there to be a postcolonial study of code, or a postcolonial code itself, code written in languages other than English, and not just different programming languages, linguistic languages as well. What about the dynamics of spaces where coding happens or doesn't happen? Gender dynamics, racial dynamics, things like that. How are these ideas then represented in the code itself? Are they represented in the code itself? How can we read that? How can that be read differently or similarly to a text that you would conventionally read in an English class? Why or why not? How does this allow for different interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, endeavors through this aspect of modern life that is all around us in different ways that we may not be able to see. We are running things on our computers right now where our payment transactions, our lighting, all these kinds of things are being run by different types of algorithms and code and things like that. And so what this broad area of study, and folks, some people will not want to align themselves with something called critical code studies. They would want to prefer some different terms and things like that. It's trying to get at something of a deeper level and understanding this and engaging with this is a weird word to say, but the materiality of this code. So we're not just looking at what's online or online culture or the internet. We're looking at the building blocks of it too and trying to dig in and see what's going on. So we've assembled a panel of awesome people today to talk about some of this stuff. We want this to be a discussion with y'all as well. So I'm going to introduce them one by one, and they're going to speak a little piece on some things, and we have some kind of prepared questions, but we want this to be a pretty free-flowing conversation. I said y'all can interject, ask questions anytime you want, and we'll get started. So to my immediate right is Jeff Kersner. He is a master's student in computer science as well, works for OIT as well. He's worked on a number of interdisciplinary projects, including the Houses of Worship project, which is a project with religious studies and the Immigration History Research Center. To his right is Allison Link, who is with Extension and OIT, and we've had lots and lots of philosophical conversations about what it means to bring not just coding practices into a field of study, but also how do the spaces that coding happens, these things like hackathons, how can we bring those into educational spaces as well and taking some of those lessons. Arvid Nelson, to her right, is the curator for the Charles Babbage Institute, which is split between the computer science department and the Archives Special Collection of the libraries, right? Awesome. And it's the history of computing. So ranging back from, the Burroughs adding machine, the Burroughs company, to control data, and he has done a long engagement with the social history of computing, the social issues in computing. And he's actually giving a presentation next week, is it the first Fridays?
Yes.
Yes.
So not on social issues in computing, but.
So he has a lot of experience in looking at the longer histories of this, because this speaks to larger questions of technology and how that has been shaped by different cultural dynamics. And finally, Chris Lindgren is not a PhD candidate yet, although I have christened him one in the information for this event in writing studies. I wish it were that easy.
Right.
In writing studies, and he and I actually have been participating in the Critical Code Studies Working Group for the last 5 weeks, which is an online gathering of critical code studies scholars, and with talking about feminist code studies and postcolonial code studies and experimental programming and things like that. And it has lots of good things to talk about in his work, and his work is focusing on gender and patriarchy and sexuality within domains of code. And he will explain more about that. So, without further ado, and as I'm going to get my picture taken by Amy, everybody smile. I'll hand it over to Chris. Yeah, Chris.
Oh, okay. If you don't mind, I'm just going to shift then up to the podium. I was like, how am I going to talk about this without showing you some of the stuff I've been thinking about for a long time now? Again, I'm Chris Lindgren. I'm from the Writing Studies Department. And it's been an interesting road looking at code and coding practices from a writing studies standpoint. Let's hope this works here. Hold on a second, let me check. Oh my gosh, awesome. And so I thought I'd take you on a little, maybe 5 to 7 minute journey of what I've been looking at. But this was today on Twitter, so I have to start here, okay? And I think it points to a really good question. This is a Twitter feed I follow. I follow a lot of programmers, and I'm really interested in how they talk about what they do. This is, I forget his real name right now, but he deals with Clojure, if I recall, and I don't know much about that particular side of programming, but he asked this question: if Mr. Spock were a programmer, the programming language he would use is fill in the blank. And I was, what's going to happen here, right? So you have some responses. The most logical, I think, white space. You have prologue, which makes sense, right? All logic. And let's see. Yeah, I like this one. Naturally, restricting oneself to a single language would be highly illogical. But also, I noticed someone retweeted it, computer science feed that I follow, and some other folks responded too. They had more things like, well, that would be Python, straightforward and logical. Erlang, obviously, best for mind melding. Someone, I think they erased their tweets. It's not here anymore. Right. Someone put, pardon my French, brain fuck. I don't know if you've heard of that particular language, but it's this idea of obfuscation, right? You can't read it, and because I think it has to do with that picture, right? I mean, look at that picture. I'm not even sure. I'm kind of a Trekkie, but I don't quite understand. I know there's a mind meld going on, but all this to say, it's interesting how people are responding to this question and trying to kind of, you have this representational system, right, that is a programming language. And then you have identities and cultures surrounding these languages, right, with these representational systems. So we know Spock is a Vulcan, he's logical, so what kinds of languages would be, so I thought that was interesting, just a way to kind of start off this thing we call round table.
Just looked up that particular language, and it's defined on Wikipedia as a Turing tar pit that is supposed to be intentionally obfuscatory and not do actually anything practical. It's just supposed to aggravate and amuse.
That which it does. So anyways, I just thought that was interesting way to kind of start off. But more specific to my own interests and where I started off with this idea of what were some of my projects that I could say align with critical code studies and what it means is, I thought, well, I asked myself kind of a question when I first caught wind of this particular field of study. What types of code would I try to read, analyze, examine, kind of build methodologies from? And I decided, I caught wind of this project the glitch codec tutorial, glitch artist Nick Breeze, based out of Chicago. He's a Dirty New Media artist. He created this awesome tutorial to basically learn how to glitch the FFmpeg codec library by basically just manipulating the data structures. And he has this really extensive tutorial. And he follows the lineage of Adrian Mackenzie, who looked at the politics of these different codec libraries. I don't know if any of you are familiar with codec libraries, but essentially just the ability for us to actually view these videos and things online in a much more condensed way, right? They encode it, they shrink up, they take bits out that they don't need, and it spits out a smaller file, right? It's a very ugly version, I know, but essentially I thought, well, let's start off something so technical, so dense, written in C of all things, and see what we can do with that. So I decided to take on a project looking at the rhetorical stylistics of data bending. So data bending is a type of act as glitch artists kind of associate themselves with, where you take some data within a file, you just change some values, sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes intentionally, just depends on who you are in your practice, and you create stuff like this that looks like this. And you can watch Nick Breeze's videos online if you want. But in the tutorial, I was looking at, you can't really see it, but this is the FFmpeg library and like the flow of control of all the information. And I just looked at one very particular thing right here. In his tutorial, he points to these lines of code right here, located within the FFmpeg. This is on my computer. So where's the file? The actual file is right here. There it is. So I took the challenge in one of my seminars to, how can I critically examine the social, cultural aspects of doing stuff with those lines of code? Because to me, they just look like very pure technical things, right? But if you take if you look at these things situated in their situation, in the context of how they're being used, I think you can find unique ways of articulating what's going on. And in this case, I was looking at the rhetorics of it too. I'm from writing studies. I'm interested in rhetorical studies. And so I looked at how Nick Breeze was taking up the FFmpeg library as a means to take end users and say, hey, don't be afraid of these files. Do something with them. Look at sandbox. Think of these little lists here of numbers, a sandbox, to see what you can produce based on just arbitrarily changing some of these values. And so that's one project you can look up if you want. It's currently at this new journal called Push, and this is it on GitHub. So I don't know, I can send this to Justin, all these things, if you want to take a look at this particular article. What about some other things? Has anyone heard about this? This go-to kibosh, or this lack of braces within the code? So Apple had this kind of unfortunate event where we have this go-to fail here. So this is a verification check where basically, because it didn't have braces, someone kind of probably just went in, made a mistake, and added this extra go-to. And so it completely negates the whole actually verifying whether something's safe. And that has some consequences, right? Some potential consequences behind that. Just a little tiny, because of a stylistic thing too, right? Not using braces, harder to read, harder to catch. You have people coming and going, right? There's some consequences because of little tiny obscure things like that. What else? Okay, last thing I wanted to kind of talk about and just kind of throw out there is, maybe I'll do a little demo. Has anyone heard of this Chrome extension called Jailbreak the Patriarchy? Okay. Can we just test it real quick? I don't know why I use Raphael, but he's my favorite tennis player. It was just the first thing that came to my mind. But, so Chrome extension called Jailbreak the Patriarchy. The developer of this decided, hey, how about we create an extension that swaps out all of the pronouns, the gendered pronouns, or at least as many as we can come up with. And so if we just take a look here and click the button, let's toggle patriarchy according to the developer. Takes a second here. I think I'm hooked up to the internet. Yep. Okay. Yeah, right. Usually doesn't take this. There we go. So maybe you notice some things that are different. All the he's, the his's became her, herself. King of the clay became queen of the clay. Here, this is all it switched was that it said male or female before, now it says female or male, so you have a positional thing there. And it was just like this little experiment she had. From what I've read up on Daniel Sucher, who's the person who wrote this, and the code is up on GitHub too, if you want to look at it. She had this idea. She was talking with a friend, and she wrote some code in response to this idea of what if we changed the way we read online? But what's interesting about this is I was intrigued by just the act of doing something like this, right? But also, when I read the reviews, there were some problems. One person in particular who identified themselves as trans said they hated this thing. Another person who brought up transgender also articulated the disdain they had, and they called it 2-second wavy for me. And so clearly there's a demarcation of this tends to be some kind of feminist thing going on here, but it's at the invisible expense of somebody else too, right? So we have non-binary, transgender people who identify in those realms who unfortunately, let's say if we went to this website, which is, I don't know if anyone's heard of Redefining the Real, Janet Mock, transgender movement. What if someone's reading this and using this, right? This is just a for instance, right? So this person who identifies themselves as trans woman, everything would be switched around, right? And pronouns, the language we use in English anyways, right? Pronouns are very much attached to our bodies, right? And our identities there. So a lot of people criticized this code in many ways because of that abrupt and very brute force way of switching out the gendered pronouns. And if you look at the code itself, you can see here's the data structures here. So here's you got your associative array of goddess, god, right? The key value pairs. Here it's using regex. That's the mode it's using. And if I want to just point out this one thing, then I'll be done. Look at this. I think this is the key thing here. We have an exchange system going on here of bodies and identities associated with pronouns, right? Gendered pronouns. Look at the use of the replace method. I think this is what's most interesting, is that it is used everywhere, right? And all of this does is swap the gender, right? But how critical does it go beyond that? Could we call this really critical code? If it only simply exchanges the bodies without anyone's permission too, and kind of playing around with their identities. And so I've had ideas about how can we respond to this code with more code to create more of a discourse around it, and these ideas of transgender and non-binary. Why not use the test method within the regex library, and then do something else to maybe tap into some narratives that are being constructed on the Redefining Real websites, and utilize that kind of knowledge to essentially be more critical about what is going on with these gendered pronouns in our language, right? Versus just simply replacing it and just kind of having a little laugh, right? Hi, he's the queen of the clay now, right? There's an expense happening there. And I think that this interesting exchange here, this is maybe a step in a direction of some kind of idea of feminist code, but I think there's more we could do with it, right? So that's just all I'll say. These are some projects of mine that I've been toying around with recently, and hopefully we can talk about it as we each talk about our own projects.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
No, I wish I would have brought a PowerPoint. I'm probably the least code specific speaker here today. But just in terms of context, I do represent the Charles Babbage Institute, which focuses on the history of information technology. And one of the questions that was posed to us to think about from Justin was, is there a gap between the humanities and computer science? And that's a gap that we're always sort of balancing, because a lot of our researchers really are historians, although we do, of course, get plenty of questions pertaining to the actual technical aspects of the materials in our collections from often lawyers, as well as some actual computer scientists. But even within the humanities, the thing that I became interested in a few years ago was that there still seems to be a very heavy bias towards the industry, towards the technology, and less on the human. I stubbed my toe on this myself when I was receiving emails from a bookseller in San Francisco who, on a weekly basis, was trying to sell me a 1950s pamphlet from the Communist Party about the dangers of automation for the American worker, and I deleted it religiously every week when I got it. And the last time, as I hit delete, I heard myself say, "We don't collect this kind of thing." And that was when I said, well, why don't we? And so it was $10, so I bought it and showed it to the faculty, and they were thrilled. So the thing that I discovered is that a lot of collections like us have been very much focused on collecting the voices of the industry itself, the companies and the computer scientists. So they tend to be self-congratulatory, I would say. I mean, nobody crows about their failures, although those often teach a lot of good lessons. But even more so, they just sort of have this basic presumption that technological advancement is good in and of itself. And so I decided explicitly to start looking for voices that were outside of the industry, most of which I'd say initially started off as being specifically negative. Negative reactions, again, commonly to the loss of jobs through automation, early concerns about privacy and data. Over time, though, I noticed that there was sort of a migration, what I call an evolution of fear about the computer. And in the 1980s, you see publications like Processed World, which really looked not at the loss of jobs, but how jobs were being transformed, that people were seen as people being made as part of a process, part of the machine in and of itself, that was very dehumanizing. At the same time that women were being a bit more explicit about the fact that there weren't many opportunities for them with computerization, that it was just more of an extension of the development of clerical work. I did encounter, though, some very utopian ideas about the computer, some going back to the 1960s, anarchist publications that pitted themselves specifically against Marxists, to say that the Marxists were fetishizing the concept of labor, and that we should be embracing technology in order to sort of rid us all of the need to work and share the wealth, which then bumped directly into conflict with more capitalist industry, which said, why should we share the wealth when it was the stockholders that made the investments? But then we get a lot of religious utopianism and utopian communities that were built up around the computer, but probably more along the lines of what this group is looking at is in the 1990s, I started seeing less of a concern about the computer and more about different communities talking about, well, how can we get in on this? How can we use this as a tool, as a democratic tool, as a tool to get our own voices heard, or to improve our own station in life? And we do see more of young women primarily writing to one another about this. And then there's an emergence of, I don't have as many of these yet, but publications centered around race and ethnicity. If anybody wants to look at these are my only copies right now. I went off on a search around the country for a research tour trying to find materials, and I try not to go too long, but I went to the Computer History, not the Computer History Museum, the Silicon Valley Archives at Stanford, and didn't find a lot. I think they had the same sort of blinders that we had, that that's just not what we did. So I ended up finding materials in the labor history archives at San Francisco State University and in the women's zine collection at Barnard College, as well as a really good zine collection down here at MCTC. So I found things like Geek Girl, which is very explicit. It's out of Australia, and it talks specifically about the role of women, the opportunities for women and young girls, not just in the computer industry, but taking advantage of the technology to build community, to shatter ideas. And they also, it's a great publication for referencing other organizations and publications and websites. There's this whole strain of materials in the 1990s that people used the zine, the concept of this paper self-publishing, in order to talk about computing. Do you know the website Boing Boing? That started as a zine. So I just got issue number 1 recently, which I'm really excited about. But I love this one, which is How to Web. It's hand-drawn, photocopied, but they basically say, why do web pages? What are web pages? And then they show code and what you actually need to do to create one. But this was distributed in paper. So I'll summarize just by saying that I'm continuing to look at these questions, but I'm really trying to change the conversation about the history of computing from the history of the people who have a vested interest in the development and sale of the technology, and make it more about the communities that are impacted, that see threats, that see promises, and how they learn to live with this. So.
Thanks, sir.
I guess I'll maybe position myself also not so deeply in the code space and a little more in the social space. So I'm Allison. I'm an academic technologist over at University of Minnesota Extension, so St. Paul campus. And I guess I'll say a victim or a user of code every day. I mean, most of us are in some ways, but I do think it's really interesting when you're positioned trying to do something like education through a medium of code. I feel that really intensely in academic tech world, that code is the medium, and I run up against walls in very concrete ways when the higher end is education. So one question that Justin posed to us that I like and that sits with me is the idea, is code neutral, or is that just a straw man kind of argument? And I feel that in a very embodied way with the educators I work with every day, where half the time I feel like I'm apologizing for code because they have a pedagogical idea of what they want to do, and the code doesn't let them do that if we're doing online outreach. So that's just a place I feel it day to day. I guess I'll take a step back too. So kind of personal history I think has been interesting to me, how I've gotten interested in code, period, because to be honest, I wouldn't have expected that I would have ever, if you'd asked me at the age of 12, would I do anything with coding, I would have said no. One of the reasons I would have said that is because my mother was into, she was a programmer analyst, and then it's not cool to be like your mom in any way, shape, or form. So I got into foreign languages and kind of natural languages and became a geek in that way. But discovered sort of later the similarities there. It felt for me very natural to come into computers, especially in the educational realm. It felt like a similar intellectual endeavor as learning foreign languages, similarly creative. But I think it was hard to explain to my sister even, since when do you like playing with computers? Who are you with computers? And it felt like a very natural shift for me from somebody who was really into foreign languages to move into that space. I'm trying to think. One sort of formative experience too. So it wasn't until about college when I sort of got intrigued by the open source community, and I think that also is what persuaded me to think about code, just as a political critique. At the end of college, I had some friends who were increasingly using Ubuntu on their machines, just more out of political conviction and a little bit out of geekiness, but they were also not major coders. And when it became clear that there were people operating in these really interesting democratic ways, in a way that I hadn't seen democracy enacted in my country ever, and you start examining just what makes something like Ubuntu possible as an operating system. I think it's a really beautiful thing, and I think it's a really interesting critique of politics as we know it, and democracy as I'd always known it throughout my life. So just the fun of using something, but also the fun of the story behind it and the system behind it that makes something like that possible, got me on board without just philosophically, I guess. And then I think, so another interesting way also that the reason this question of is code neutral sits with me is also kind of the gendered perspective. One way that I think I got pulled into thinking about code as well that I think was a really concrete, welcoming space that I needed personally was an experience I had in Salzburg, Austria. I spent some time doing Fulbright over there and spent a 2-week, it was an early iteration of a program that they had at the University of Salzburg where they identified sort of a lack of interest. I think even more over in Austria in particular. It's a relative. Has anyone been to Austria? I don't want to disparage it too much, but it's a relatively conservative country.
The consulate on the phone.
We don't need we're not web broadcasting this or anything, no. But it's a relatively conservative country, and I do think that their gender relations are different from what I expected going over there, and I think they're noticing a gap in women entering technology fields more so maybe even than here. So they, some kind of intrepid folks at the University of Salzburg decided to do a 2-week cohort program, and they said all women, all taught by women, and it will be about 15 or so a smaller cohort, and they would bookend it with a little more of a social structure. So we started kind of getting to know, we'd eat lunch together, we'd do some get to know you things, we'd do some sort of leadership development, and then kind of do coding and hacking and playing. One of the first things they had us do there too, which I thought was really enlightened, is to completely take apart a computer, then rebuild it, and then install like 3 different open operating systems on it, and prove to you that you could break something and rebuild it. And that was something that I realized I hadn't had a space for earlier in life. It wasn't me sitting in my basement with my friends doing that. I know that a lot of men and kind of or boys in sort of middle school era, that would be the age when you'd maybe do that, and I do think that's a transformative experience for anyone who's done that. So that was kind of a neat space, but that was a particularly designed space. I think that was really important for me to get into thinking about code, feeling empowered in code. So in that sense, I also think code isn't really neutral. It's social in exciting ways for me, but it is really socially contextualized. So, all right, that's my soapbox.
I'm Jeff. I will situate myself at the opposite end of the spectrum in the deeply technical field. I'm a developer for the Office of Information Technology and in the Masters of Computer Science program, the College of Science and Engineering. My research interests are in digital humanities and sorts of what are the techniques that can be used for computing to sort of break down barriers in terms of data modeling. Computers they're fine in and of themselves as object of research, but they have little to no value unless they are of use to somebody else. So how do you go about making computers more practical for more applications? Visualization, data modeling, networks, things like that. So that's one area. And then professionally, I have a very strong interest in the idea of transparency in computing systems. How can you make it so that your users are aware of the types of changes, some of the open source things that Chris showed us? What can you do to involve communities who are normally excluded or marginalized, as Allison described, and how does that change over time? What is the history of a particular platform of software look like? So those are the sorts of questions that I try to address. Most of my time I spend doing, I actually do a lot of engineering, so it's a lot of testing and a lot of sort of rigorous framework things. So I think there's a broad spectrum of opportunity, and that there is a place for a great many people at the software table and the code studies table, and that there is no particular barrier to entry. How can we address that problem? How do we make it so that on the one hand big enterprise systems are accessible to people, and so that academic systems are accessible to people? So that's from 10,000 feet.
I'm going to jump back down to somewhere in the middle, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet. And something you said, Allison, you talked about natural languages, and that was just an interesting phrase in this context. And thinking about, a lot of these, we talked about multiple programming languages, and we talked about, that this is a different type of language. And I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit, of like how we think about these as languages and how they relate to languages that are machine read and human read. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Before we get into starting the discussion, I just wanted to make a semantic clarification. I hear you guys using the word code in a lot of different ways, and I want to know what you all really mean when you say it, because when I hear it, I think, here's the text that I use to program. It's in a language. Maybe it's in binary, but that's still language, and I see that as distinct from the software, like it running, how a user would see it. So could you just clarify what you mean?
Do you want to just go down the road?
I'm concerned with the code that you write, and from my background as a writing studies scholar, and I've looked at writing technologies, the materialities of them. So I've looked at the software side, the politics of the interface, so to speak. But I'm also interested in, as a literacy scholar too, the practices involved in let's say, the what's appropriate way to write a for loop within a particular domain of a professional sphere in Python, right? So I do, when I say code, I'm meaning the actual practice of writing that particular representational system and working within that system.
I guess I'd say, I think that is probably the question for
Yeah.
the rest of the afternoon. So I think I would leave that open as tension. But when I examine myself, I think I notice I'm most interested in the act of coding and the social context in which that occurs. So that gets a little bit away from this sort of almost a textual read on it. But I do think the ways people enact it, learn to code, teach each other to code. I do think, though, there's some kind of transmission of style. There's stylistic transmissions that go on there. Even choice of what languages to learn, I think, is involved in that. So it's on a different, more enacted end of it. But
So I have 3 aspects that I'm thinking from. I'm thinking from the code aspect, number 1, as you say, it's the thing that I put down that works. I tend to have a fairly strong opinion about languages that are about people who identify code as non-executable code yet still code. I scope that outside of the definition for myself, which is a very strong position to take, I am aware, but I think you have to draw a line somewhere, and that is my line in the sand. Number 2 is the verb code, as in I'm going to sit down and code. There is a difference between me sitting at a computer typing code and me sitting with my colleagues in a room working out what is the most applicable way to code something. There's a difference between hacking and design by committee. They are both valid. They have their realms. And the 3rd scope is code as encoding, as in how do we capture natural languages. And a good example of that is the DNS system, which up until a number of years ago only recognized 7-bit ASCII, but the world does not speak 7-bit ASCII. They speak a variety of languages using a variety of character systems. And the code, the thing that implements bind that sits under the DNS system, encodes language in such a way that other languages, people who naturally will speak Arabic or Hebrew or languages that don't use the 7-bit ASCII alphabet, are forced to recode their own notion of language in order to fit into that coded binary system that only works in one regard with 7-bit ASCII. So those are the 3 aspects that I'm taking code to mean.
Can you say more about why that distinction and why that clarification is necessary for you?
I don't really care specifically what you mean as long as I know what you
Okay.
mean. So for example, when Allison was saying her bit, she was saying when she would work with professors, she would find herself working against code because these professors wanted to do this pedagogical idea, but they found that the code was a hindrance. And in in my eyes, that seemed like more of the software is a hindrance, not like specifically the code.
Mhm.
Which is sort of I think one of the sort of misnomers of critical code studies is that critical code studies is not just about a reading system. It is not literate programming. It's not about reading and understanding code as a necessarily form of writing. It's about understanding the implications of the code for a wider cultural lens or cultural perspective. So that's, I think, part of the confusion with, I mean, even when I was starting, when I was starting out with critical code studies, it's part of the difficulty is scoping the field. What's in bounds, what's out of bounds, and it's up to you to, I think in my world, draw your own line in the sand for where you think code stops and starts.
Yeah, I did run into an interesting, and I kind of value that. I do think there's two. So the space I work in is a very applied field, right? So I see code as sort of something that shapes our kind of life actions. And I would actually say that that's a factor of the code. I would include that as part of a code. So something, if I'm not able to do something pedagogically, and Moodle I think is the thing where we're usually not able to do something pedagogically or are able to do something pedagogically. But I use the word code in that context. And often it's actually something that I do with instructors as well. So there have been times where I felt like I've needed to sit down and say, and explain the nature of open source culture. Sort of a crash course in it, and explain Moodle is something we don't pay for, and it comes from a community, et cetera, and the code base works this way, or it's slow in this way, or enroll is spelled in this way because of this culture. So I do think that's, I don't know, that comprehends code for me, and that sort of inertia of a community with a broad code base I do consider that part of our discussion of it. So.
I have a question about code that goes to the code you were displaying, Chris, on the screen, the code underlying whatever Wikipedia was putting out there. The code was revealed using some software we were using, I guess. What software and what does it do for us?
Oh, sure. Well, what is the bunny trail? I'm a big avid fan of Twitter, so just a little story. How I found it is that I found the extension via Twitter. I searched for it in the Chrome browser extension store.
Right.
I'm actually a Firefox user, so that was like a step for me to do. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
And then I was curious. I was like, oh, this is interesting. I wonder what does the code look like, right?
Yeah.
So I looked up in some of the spaces that I know of, and sure enough, the developer, she maintains her own website, and she's also on GitHub. I'm also on GitHub, a version control system, and she posted her code there for people. She has a license, so you can get into copyright issues too, right? But she just demands that you recognize that this was the first, and then you make sure this license is here if you want to create a different version of it. And there have been ported to other things. There's actually a Firefox one that's been created. There's gender neutral version, so it doesn't do a swap, but it actually just does gender neutral pronouns. And that one's in Firefox. But all this to say, yeah, I found it on GitHub. I forked it. I actually created my own response to it. I exploited the fact that JavaScript, I removed every single pronoun key value pair in each of the arrays. I named them all differently, and I exploited the fact that now these are all undefined. So now when I press the button, instead of it swapping, all it does now is add undefined before the word. So it'll say undefined Raphael, undefined Nadal, right? Just to kind of explore the absurdity of the action that it's doing. I think that's what's interesting about this kind of thing you can do with these writing systems, is that you can also respond by making something in response to this other thing, right? Yeah, I found it on GitHub, short answer.
I wonder if that, as Allison said, that this is that gap that we think about or we talk about. If this is and Arvid talked about the kind of humanities, computer science, or if this, the kind of the straw man, I don't think this is true, but is this a replication of an earlier moment in perhaps literature or textual studies where it's, we're looking at the text itself, and then we're looking at that which is around it or that which is signified by it. I don't know.
I don't see any, my kind of perspective on that is this idea of you have computer science and you have, in my case, I come from writing studies. It's an issue of like, what do you want to produce as a scholar or an academic computer scientist or a literacy scholar, right? So there's different unit of analyses and there's different generative work based on your research methods and your methodologies. And sometimes they'll overlap. And I'm interested in some of those spaces. And I'm not entirely sure exactly what those spaces will be, but I think this idea of a field of study that works to try to see how, look, there are these kind of nebulous as they are spaces where, look, you might find that a writing studies scholar might have some very interesting things to say about coding practices. And that's what I'm hoping my career creates, because I think there is. And that's part of, I'm hoping to go in and look and do some ethnographic work with people who write code, situated, and watch them and observe and do some kind of empirical work that way. I think there's some interesting things to kind of talk about with the social, individual, even cognitive. I'm very interested in cognitive aspects with this how do we solve these problems through these representational systems? How do the epistemic actions that we take, and how is that represented in the code itself too, right? I think those are, right now as a literacy scholar too, I think there's lots of issues with calling coding a literacy. I think we should step back from that for a moment because we're reaching, there's a lot of problems with kind of going into that term. But that might be a whole other discussion.
I'm curious about that, and I'm kind of suspecting some of you may have had this conversation in ways that I haven't, but what would be the issue with calling coding a literacy?
It implicates it in the baggage that literacies has. Thinking back to the 60s with regards to Johnny Can't Write. Now we have, Johnny Can't Code.
Chris Bosch, advocating for kids to start coding.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was part of a 2-year program, after school program, to do computing with kids. And so I've been in these domains and I've looked at the discourses around coding and pushing it for a new mass literacy, and a lot of the pushes for it are problematic, and they're following some of the same patterns as before. Very economically driven, right? And one other facet to kind of draw on is, with regards to literacy studies, there's a theories called Great Leap theories. This idea that there's this huge cognitive gain by learning how to write. But when in fact a landmark study by Scribner and Cole in 1981, their published work, has proven that those Great Leap theorists of writing and literacies, it's not true, right? I mean, there's very situated cultural practices wound up in the act of writing. And so I'm curious at how, I might make some enemies here, how Papert has maybe, Seymour Papert, I don't know if anyone knows who that is. I love his work, and he's worked with kids too, and there's an interesting lineage there, talk about history of computing initiatives since the 1960s to get kids to code that have failed, and now finally everyone's like, everyone needs to code, goddammit, right? But Papert's work kind of follows that kind of Onian thread of, if you learn how to code, it's learning how to think. And his protege, Nicholas Negroponte, has taken that to the new level of globalizing this One Laptop Per Child initiative and taking that to the next level. And I think there's some problems with regards to saying, again, is there a great cognitive gain, really, by learning how to code, about learning how to create this jailbreak the patriarchy app? Maybe, I don't know, right? But if we take a little hint from Scribner and Cole and their work to kind of prove that that's not necessarily the case, there's some good things to say about it, but I'm just trying to temper the claims that are being made about coding and learning to code, right? That's part of my work that I'm interested in.
But isn't the term literacy also involve access?
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean,
very much so.
That's what I'm thinking when I'm hearing
Entirely
literacy.
so.
Everybody who doesn't have the ability, I mean, there's a historical precedent with like Latin, for example, and controlling the church. I mean, it's very similar with the people who can code and who have access to code. So is there a problem with using literacy in that sense?
Well, I think that is exactly the space that a lot of the folks from the side of pro and con use against each other too. Access is a very interesting rhetorical space. Douglas Walls, if anyone's interested, wrote his dissertation on access as rhetorical. But it's very problematic. It can be used in positive ways, but you have Douglas Rushkoff. I don't know if anyone's aware of his work. Learn to code, get a job. That was his opinion piece at CNN. And he's banking on creating these access points. Everybody needs to learn to code, but we're not really thinking about building an infrastructure to do that. I think there's positive things happening though. Like Women Who Code is an initiative that I think is very positive. It's similar to, Allison, your experience, I think, with regards to creating a safe space for these things to happen. And so I don't see anything inherently wrong with learning to code, and I don't see any, I'm very interested in these ideas of a new push for it, more and more people to get involved. But on a mass level, what does that really mean, right? What are we really, who's saying this, and why are they saying it? I think it's just important to temper that in.
I think what we're going to notice, though, and this to me, I think we're all already feeling it, which is probably why many of us are here, is that coding is increasingly connected to political agency and just personal agency in society. This book is one that it just always sits with me, and I can pass it around. Anyone's welcome to come back to it. But Linear, who says the way I read it basically is code is the new substrate on which politics will be enacted. I mean, it is another space that we are going to have to contend with, that our political decisions will sit in, will touch always. We can't ignore it. I think I'm noticing, at least, that our politicians are not always well equipped to deal with that and to advocate in those spaces for us, but it is going to absolutely be a realm, and it is already a realm on which we're making political decisions and forced to make political decisions. And I do think in the same way that becoming literate, I don't, literacy's intentions around literacies, I don't find the word literacy that problematic. I construe it with agency and things like that. So sense of agency, I would say, in the same sense that literacy equips you for that in a political realm, I would say coding will increasingly be part of that as well.
I think the literacy makes it a little more interesting and easier to grapple with, because one of the things, this question of what are we talking about when we talk about code is kind of where I stubbed my toe when I was asked to be on this panel in the first place. I said, well, I think it's a really interesting question, but I was thinking specifically about code, the structures of the coding languages. And is a coding language particularly inherently feminist or sexist? My reaction to that was, how do we even know? I mean, we don't have a basis of comparison. We don't have languages that are created by women as opposed to languages that are created by men in mass that we can look and see what are their inherent structures and how do they differ. It's like saying, is Latin more sexist than Greek? How do we analyze, how have we conducted philological analysis with natural languages in the past? And it's not by looking at the semantic structure of the languages themselves, it's looking at the output. One describes Sappho as being, demonstrating femininity within Greek lyric poetry by, all it is fragments. I mean, you can't even look at, what her poetic structure is, and it's basically, she uses a lot of nouns that are associated with domesticity. So it's again that level. It's what are the things that we create, which is what we've been analyzing up till now, in terms of, do things represent particular perspectives? And so I think that broadens our ability to look at code analysis in terms of not the underlying language itself, but what is created. That said, I think, these are intentionally constructed languages, and we've done some, and we have opportunities to do others. So what does literacy mean? Is literacy teaching people how to use the languages that are already done? And so is that teaching them to think? Someone said learning to code is learning how to think. Well, think whose language? Is there something to be gained by creating different language? So I mean, I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I think it raises interesting problems.
If there's anybody interested in some of the people I know who've taken up some of those ideas are from glitch studies. Daniel Temkin, Temkin, brilliant artist, and he's very interested in these matters, and he's very interested in these obfuscation, especially. Yes, thank you. Just looking at the snow, I'm just like, oh. But he's interested in making these types of languages along the lines and the lineage of brainfuck, and he's interested in operationalizing them to create these types of glitch artifacts. But what's interesting about his claims too is that the fact that he writes things that look like they're broken, they're very algorithmic, they're very discrete. He's not lying about like how intentional he is about these instigations that he's doing. And so he has a very interesting argument in that, like, there's very much intention in everything I do and how I write it, which is to the chagrin of some of the culture artists out there too in his community. But I think a very interesting point he's making.
Yeah, kind of on the issue of these languages being intentionally made becomes even more problematic as you think about how they are made. So, on a kind of, it's on a surface level, it looks as though they are intentionally made. Somebody sits down and writes, the Ruby code or the C++ code with, certain goals in mind, and it is what it is, and people follow the rules, otherwise it doesn't work the way what they want it to. But on another level, it isn't intentionally made because it is connected to the language of the person who made it, and the language is not intentionally made. For example, in the code that we just saw on the screen, I saw words like function, if, then, and those are not intentionally made words. That's language that we know, not because we read it in some code manual. It's language that we know because we use it every day, and nobody intentionally decided what if and then means, in the broader sense. Maybe in this code they did, but we are kind of guided, and the person who wrote the code is guided in his decision in how to put, or her decision in how to put the code together to create this new code. By that larger social context.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't, it is intentionally made in one sense, but in another sense it's not. And then once you make that connection, then we have the ASCII thing is an example of, so we have this huge network of code that is based on Latin alphabet and on English words. And anybody who wants to learn how to code has to learn those words. So they have an additional step that nobody in this room has if they want to learn how to code, at least in the most popular coding languages out there. And so then, you can extend that to like the literacy question very easily. Why don't these people know how to code? What's the matter with them? Well, I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is not just in them by any means. It's inherent in the system of coding and how we think about it. And that's why we have projects like in the Arab world. There's a project where some guys worked for years, and finally a few years ago they made an entirely Arabic version of Unix.
Right.
So this what was on the thread.
I think someone's actually
yeah.
I think someone's actually ported Python to Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and pull that up.
Okay.
But yeah,
That's-
there's an entangled state between human and programming languages, right?
yeah.
I think Winograd and Flores, right? Computers and cognition talk about. They take up that issue of like this distinction, these boundaries we've created between this idea of boundaries between programming and human languages, right? They're very much especially in higher level languages like JavaScript, right? Those logical statements, you have naming practices, and how that defines and shapes the programs you create, which is supposed to also convey to your audience, your human audience, what's going on. So there's a lot of things going on there.
Well, it's an interesting conundrum that you raised, but I mean, I think that it's still something that is, you know, intentionally created within the boundary of the tools that one has. And now I think you,
Oh, yeah,
by talking about
Yeah.
the difference between native languages, I think you highlight something that for you know, me thinking as a native English speaker with languages that are created with this, all I see is the personal agency in creating the language. I'm not seeing the boundary that's imposed that somebody else might if they're coming from a non-native language.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you mentioned, though, was if this is what you need to do if you want to work with the most popular languages. But then that raises the whole idea of hegemony and cultural capital, and you know, can that be overturned? So there's another layer there, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and having learned Java in a German-speaking setting, it was funnily pretty unproblematic. And I know that's, you know, my own personal experience, and but I was
so
looking.
when you say in a German-speaking setting, do you mean you were coding and it didn't say if then, it said German stuff?
No, but it said if then.
Everybody who was
Well,
coding,
we were. I mean, we were doing, you know, Java programming in English and in the kind of in
Okay.
the universal way that the world now does that, but learning it in German.
So you're
Yeah.
okay.
So this was in Salzburg during that kind of time I was there.
So did you see German speakers
Interact with it, and yep, and learning
figuring it out?
Yep, and I mean,
Did
yeah,
it look like-
you know, I was a student in that course I think I was the only international student for them, so the rest were either Austrians or Germans learning it. And I was looking for signs of felt hegemony, or, you know, I'm an English speaker who's learned German and spent a lot of time doing that, and, you know, want them to kind of stand up for their language and be proud of that and sort of be indignant when English is, you know, the ascendant language, et cetera, and they never really do that. It doesn't really happen in Germany or in Austria. But I also...
Probably a little different.
The
from
French do it a
Arab
little
world,
differently, you know. The Germans don't do it like that.
Well,
Okay.
that makes me think about
That's interesting, actually.
So I wanted it. It didn't happen. For them it felt transparent.
You
For me
wanted
it felt
a
really
riot.
weird.
that might be an American thing
Yeah.
too, right? Like I think about tech comm and translation. You go to any school in tech comm in Europe, and all these students know multiple languages,
Mhm.
and you're only going to find classes called international technical communication in America, which is a very interesting point that was brought up to me from one of my first professors in tech comm. It's like you're not going to find this over there. This is an American thing, and here's why, right?
And that relates to what's your name?
I'm Allison.
Allison?
Yep.
To Allison's comments on space. So, for example, like in the Arab world's different from Europe, but in the Arab world, people who are more likely to be in coding classes are more likely to be very westernized, know a little bit of English, and probably be actually a little bit like the people you observed in Germany who aren't, you know, they don't have a big deal. But it's that fact that they're the ones who are likely to be in that space is kind of the issue, you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the people who are doing the coding are the westernized people. The people who are empowered or what have you by this
Well,
are the ones who are, you know, already westernized, and that's why, partially why, you know, when we get videos from the Middle East about what's really happening in the Middle East, it's from a very Western perspective. You know, we don't get like the rural, heavily Islamic view, you know, on YouTube video. We get the westernized, I live in the middle of a big city, I have access to the internet, and cultured, whatever.
I would argue that we may not have the language capabilities to look for that, because I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It just might not be on the most accessible
Oh yeah.
channels for Americans.
Yeah. Which is, yeah.
The comment about space, I'm glad you mentioned that again, because that really struck something for me too, was you were talking about, that young men and boys have a space for this, and I know, just the thought that occurred to me was, instead of, maybe Johnny can't code, what we need is a new version of A Room of One's Own, in terms of how do you create space for women that are safe, comfortable, and opportunities.
And just sort of generative spaces. I mean, and the interesting thing to me has been, the interesting thing in education too, I don't want to, again, critique any colleagues in the College of Education, but some of my most pedagogically informed spaces, just well-designed spaces that I've seen in this world, have been in hackathons and coding circles. I go there because the ideal that I have of what it means to learn and share and teach in very genuine project-oriented ways is enacted there among people who would probably never self-proclaim themselves as teachers or, in any particular way. So I do wish I could bring colleagues from the College of Education over there and just say, watch what's going on. Watch how people self-organize around a problem. Watch how they translate things, how they parcel things out, how they share, practices and build each other, bolster each other.
I don't think this is the exact thing you mentioned, but this is something that's been on the Critical Code Studies working group site, and this language that he described as completely in Arabic, and even that you're still seeing.
It's interesting because Arabic is right to left, which is a constant issue on the web. I highly doubt that the language is written left to right. I don't know if it says that there, but it's kind of aligned left, which I think is interesting. So here, even in this presentation of what this code looks like, it's altered.
What's interesting to me, so if we read paragraph about the code structure, it says this is a scheme-like language. For anyone who doesn't know, scheme is a kind of list which is a kind of functional type language, which are interesting. So number one, on your point about you're not sure whether it's left or right, the code almost certainly seems like it's left or right just because usually functions on the left and that's when one is not functional. What's interesting to me is that this is scheme, which is, while in something like C we'll have a lot of semantic structures like if and then and while loop, but scheme has much fewer of these, and it's more a general command structure. We have, here's our command, and here are our arguments, or almost everything. So in some ways, it's interesting that they use scheme because I think it allows for less of just a translation of the language that came from English and more potential for something that's truly Arabic.
Having learned scheme as our intro computer language too, scheme feels more value neutral in that way on some level. You're right. Just the structure of scheme feels like it could open up a space for. It feels like a differently blanker slate than others.
I wonder, and the way that this was introduced on here was through a discussion of so-called global Englishes and how the multiple ways that English is used, and I would say arguing against this idea of this is westernized and a kind of monolithic way. What I'd be really interested in seeing are the comments in codes like this, in this space that is both machine read and human read simultaneously of code comments. And I would love to see if they are using, if these are, I'm thinking of my friends in Ghana who do this, and if they're doing some sort of like pidgin English commenting in the code and what language that's in addition to what language they're actually quote unquote like specifically coding in, even though that other language is part of that code as well.
So here's a question that I would raise when people are talking about languages that are used in code systems. So Ruby, which is considered a fairly popular language, is the core developer lists are all conducted in Japanese, which is an interesting question because you're not dealing, the language itself is solid and written in English, and people use, symbols to identify it in the lists. It's if. You don't necessarily have to be able to understand the language in order to work with it. It's the same with mathematics. If you don't understand what the dots mean, you can infer it. And in other contexts, I would push the envelope and say that a lot of the PHP developers are Israeli, and a lot of the error messages are transliterated. So you find people Googling on the internet a lot for the, it's called Pakayim Nudotayim error, which is the double dots error, when you don't have 2 colons or you have 1 colon instead of 2. So it's interesting that people are trying to bound these discussions in breaking down the barriers to language as opposed to turning it into a lingua franca. Is it easier that people are able to interact, or should communication between culture be reserved for people who have that expert ability in order to speak the native language of both, or should there be a common computing platform? I mean, are you looking at a system to convey information seamlessly, or are you looking for a system to construct boundaries? That's a question. So just because something doesn't work in your native platform doesn't necessarily mean that that's an intrinsically bad thing.
I think this goes back to Chris and literacy, and are we trying to find a lingua franca? I mean, that lingua franca in many ways is English, but we've just spent the last 15 minutes describing how we're not just using English in this way. And so, I wonder if that gets at some of the political aspects too. Like, who is deciding that this is, like, and I think back to this thing of like, oh, Johnny has to code now, and what does that mean, and who is determining those boundaries as to like, oh, you should learn this language or this language, and is this something of, oh, this is because this is the most efficient, this is what's going to help you get a job at Google, or just those kinds of questions sort of popping up for me.
I mean, I was trying to think through, so one thing I do, one project I really value is Mozilla's work in WebMaker for digital literacies, and they're kind of trying to go into that space of defining what are digital literacies, and not in a simplistic way. And as I was thinking through this last night, kind of what are some danger spots there. I would encourage anyone to look at Mozilla if you haven't before, and some of the JavaScript libraries they're doing are really creative. I think if we define digital literacy as tool-focused, kind of instrumental, I think that's a danger. So I think if we define digital literacy as I can use Word to write a paper, and I can use a video camera, and then editing software, and then I have as sort of product tools focused, that's not forward-looking enough. That's why I like this parallel with reading literacy, writing literacy. I think it's really similar in that respect. Can I conceive of coding as a tool that I have to enact my agency, to conceive of problems, to ask questions in those ways? And I run into this a lot with colleagues, especially in the academic tech realm, where I'm increasingly surprised, where people say, I'm not a coder, hence this question stops here, where you go, this is your question that you have because you are trying to do something pedagogically with somebody. This very much affects you, but you decide, I'm not a coder, so that's not a question I'm allowed to ask.
And
that reminds me of things I hear a lot too about, well, I don't speak Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't know, it's, what do you say to that? Or any language, I don't speak French, I don't speak German.
Well, you could, and there's an argument for why you should, So I do think there's something about, when I think the critical part of critical code studies, I think of sort of the power, the ways power is sort of spread across that community, and I think there's a lot of power in that statement, I don't code or I do code, and I can never quite get past that in my work on a day-to-day basis.
And the converse to the danger of tool literacy extends into programming languages as well. I mean, it's one thing to be able to read and write and form characters. It is another idea to be able to articulate an idea using those characters into something that forms a meaningful whole. And part of the subject matter that I think is not addressed in the conversation between humanities and even humans is that computer languages make assumptions about how data should be modeled within those languages, and a lot of the different disciplines within the humanities have their own way of constructing information and knowledge, and without being able to engage with those systems of knowledge limits the ability of language designers, programming language designers, people programming systems in order to make robust enough decisions that are able to support, further investigation, research, learning, whatever it is that you're using in a meaningful way. And the problem is that computers they don't exist in a vacuum, and until there's input saying, hey, I want the computer to be able to do this, there's no impetus for anybody to be forced to design it. So the more that these conversations are had, the more that programming literacy becomes a thing that's accessible to more people. I mean, it's a multimodal learning system. It doesn't make sense to try to encode a text studies problem in a program designed for examining moments in statistics. It does not make sense. So is there a good method for examining languages in the humanities, written language? Maybe. Maybe there's a good one out there right now, but I think there's still a great deal of work to be done, and that's where the conversation, I think, should be focused a little bit more in terms of the, moment. Right now, in the moment research that's where I think a lot of work could be done still.
Unless you can do some cool data bending by using, something for text to statistics,
Yeah. Well, that's what I liked about, so that's referencing Nick Breeze's work. What drew me to that rhetorically was this advanced tutorial he created to get people to just interact with these text files that are on their computer. And then, in a way, I kind of argue in my article, Breeze is kind of encoding a culture upon and inscribing upon the people who practice this, like, to possibly take up this kind of method of interaction. So you're not necessarily with data bending writing code, you're more so just literally, sometimes arbitrarily, sometimes systematically, you're revising it. It's like this weird way of revision, sometimes destructive revision. But he gives you tools on how to make sure if you break it, you got backup system so you can go back to a former version. But it's such a nice, simple, like, here, go play. And so again, for me as a literacy scholar, I was like interested in like this very low stakes thing. And he also gives you have to put it on a stick or a CD. It runs off an old version of Ubuntu. So he created a whole environment, this sandbox again for you to play with these files that you wouldn't normally get to play with maybe on your Mac or other PC through Windows, right? Ubuntu gave him a more direct path to these things. And so he's trying to think of a way to make sure that was easier for a person who doesn't necessarily go there to go there. And so that, to me, rhetorically was interesting to look at. How do we persuade people to even go there? Go in these files, open them up, play with this thing called a data structure. There are just bits, right, of code. So that was like my first little stop along this critical code studies path.
So does he have a pedagogical agenda that goes with this? I mean, is the intention to get one not simply comfortable with it, but to learn if you do this, this is what happens, and then follow up? I mean, because it seems that it could be...
He does want you to follow up. At the end, he's like, and he says at the beginning, he kind of frames it in this idea, in this digital ecology, we need citizens who are able to form a better relationship with this technology. And so he's arguing that this is like the first step for you, and I want to see what you produce from it. So I think a few people have shown them like projects that they've created because of this tutorial since then. He's given lots of talks on this particular codec tutorial around the world.
It just seems parallel to pedagogical methods in language, in human language education. But I keep going back to Greek and Latin. My background is in Greek and Latin, but when I taught Latin in grad school, we used the Oxford method, which was this constructed language where you didn't read any real Latin authors, but you were supposed to sort of stub your toe on new words and structures as you were reading this, and it was supposed to be all. Now I hated it because I was a Wheelock person, so I mean I wanted to learn the structure, but for some audiences that really seems to work, and it seems like that this could be viable.
It's interesting. I think where it fails is like it doesn't really promote the social aspect of learning how to code. you need a support network. You need that safe space to be able to take this up. Some people don't have direct access to those things. Access becomes crucial again. For me, I've dabbled in code for a while, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself even a programmer, right? I'm more of a tinkerer, experimenter. I can read code relatively well in a few languages, but it takes me a little bit longer to write these things from scratch. But with that said, I think if Breeze is, I don't think he expects people to be able to just kind of pick it up and walk, feeling like they have this power now. But I think it just highlights how it's not an autodidact experience, right? You can't just learn this on your own in a vacuum. It takes lots of support along the way to keep you going, because it's frustrating as hell too, right? To learn these things.
I wonder. Go ahead, Michael.
This raises a question I had in the back of my mind as a social aspect of code and coding. It is possible for a person to sit down and code a program all by himself. I know because I did it using Fortran too, before BASIC was invented. But I also know that most important code is not written by a person sitting down at a table from beginning to end, that it's collaborative and collaborative over time, so that the person who makes important additions may never have met the person who started this. So how does that aspect, that very social aspect of coding, manifest itself in practical behavior, and how does it affect the code, and how does it affect us as consumers of the code, or as victims of the code?
So I can sort of speak to that. So the team that I work with, it consists of 5 developers, and we have we usually divide up the work. Coding is not something, not everything flows together in code. There are isolated portions of it. So when you think about Moodle, there is a lesson tool, there is an attendance tool, there is a gradebook tool. It is very possible to divide things up, and the danger with that is that you run into, if one person works on one thing and there are never any other eyes on it, that leads to a condition where that code is considered dangerous, and it's a black box, nobody knows how it works, and it's difficult. So we have 2 major mechanisms that we use to address that. We have peer review systems where you do submit work and you say, I need this reviewed, and usually more senior programmers will review more junior programmers. The other major method that we have is we have style guides. It's like Chicago. It's like the Chicago Manual or Strunk and White. They tell you what is good, what looks good for this. These are all. Some of them are very archaic, and yes, some of them are more useful. Some of them don't make a lot of sense, but by and large, communities come up with standards that you are expected to adopt. And then the part of this that doesn't have a good analog is that we have automated systems that can do build checks, and what happens is when you make a change to a piece of software and it goes through, the system will automatically tell you, did you meet the standard or not? If you don't meet the standard, your code is not accepted. That's one of the interesting things. The more challenging component, though, is that people think differently, and that's where the process of sort of composition and theory break down, because we don't sit down and say, all right, we're going to write this tool and hopefully it works, and then people get stuck with it. We have a team of analysts that handles the requirements gathering process, where it's expected that the inputs to the system will show sort of what the expected output is. Those expectations are translated into code by groups of programmers and then returned as people might see fit. And the difficulty there is that you're crossing a lot of domain-specific language boundaries. You're crossing pedagogy boundaries, you're crossing business boundaries, you're crossing technical boundaries, and what goes in one side doesn't necessarily come out as it's expected on the other side of things. So a lot of it is bringing people into these discussions and being able to say, you can look at the code, you can see what's going on. If you want something changed, by all means, go into Firefox, go into Chrome, break it down, fix it, show us what you want it to do, and then we'll accept your change if it meets our standards. So there's a lot of that sort of thing. The reason that we don't let anybody use our code is that when you're dealing with big systems, there's a difference between building something and hacking on it for safety and when you're running an enterprise system where you cannot suffer downtime, mistakes are critical, they cost money, they are problematic. That's the flip side to these code discussion things, is that how can you get people from this level where they feel safe and comfortable to a level where do they want to engage in serious research or serious academic production? And that's one of the questions that critical code studies, I think, hasn't addressed yet, is once you have this new pedagogy, how do you get people to that level of being able to participate in these big projects?
What I like.
Or do you?
Yeah, I was going to say what you've articulated nicely is how there's different exigencies, there's different domains, and you have these bigger projects that demand different ways of going about the composition process. And so I don't know if, is that even a concern of CCS? I don't know. Are you saying that it should be?
I think it should be, yes. I think it should be well within the domain. I mean, if you're going to engage with code, you should engage with all of code, or the domain sort of loses some of its strength. I mean, then you're talking about, well, we're interested in this particular subset. Well, that's not all of code.
Yeah.
So.
I keep going back because there's this distinction that I just read on the bus over here that I really like, because I do think there's something to be said for almost on levels of analysis, right? So are we on this sort of micro, close read sort of analysis versus enacted code in the social space, in a legacy historic space, just the ways that happens. GitHub is a really great embodiment of a visual embodiment even of how code has legacies that live online, and you can go and look through them all the time. And so this, he talks about, he says it's about computers versus code, but so we'll just assume computers and code are kind of the same thing. He talks about ideal versus real computers, and he says ideal computers or code can be experienced when you write a small program. So you're kind of tinkering at your own desk. They seem to offer infinite possibilities and an extraordinary sense of freedom. Real computers or code are experienced when we deal with large problems. They can trap us in tangles of code and makes us slaves to legacy, and not just in matters of obscure technological decisions. Real computers reify our philosophies through the process of lock-in before we are ready.
That's a very nice quotation. What book is this?
This is You Are Not a Gadget.
By
Jerome Lanier. He's out in the West Coast, and a technologist out there. So
that answered my question.
I was just telling Jeff earlier, this is a quasi-religious experience when I first read this book. So if you want that, go for it.
Was there a question over there? I didn't know if I saw something.
It's 4:30, so I gotta go. Y'all can keep talking, but this will be the official end. I want to thank all of the panelists for a great discussion. Thank you guys for a great discussion. Our next event is in somewhat of a continuity with this, is on data arts. So going towards some more of the data bending, different ways of thinking about expressing data. We're going to have some visualizational stuff. We're going to have some sonification stuff. Different ways of thinking about questioning, using data that, again, we are is all around us and is such a big thing now with big data. And different ways of imagining it. So that's going to be April 15th, tax day. If you're not doing your taxes that day, you can come out 2:30 to 4 o'clock over in the influx space over in the Regis building. If you're not on our list, go to the Dash website, lib.umn.edu/dash, and sign up and get more information. And the information about that event is online as well. So thanks for coming. Come chat with folks. We're going to get to the airport.